in variance analysis. All right, so on Blackboard there's both a PowerPoint that these 3 slides are from, as well as some outline notes you can look through. Standard costing, well, what's a standard? Standard is simply a benchmark, a norm, what you expect. So when we're going to be talking about direct materials, what you expect to pay for your direct materials. You have some sort of agreements with suppliers, or you have an idea of what you spent in the past. That's a standard. What you expect to spend for raw materials. As well, how many raw materials you use. Sometimes think about it like a recipe. That's a standard. You're supposed to put in a bag of chocolate chips. Well, then that's what your standard is. A standard cost system is a costing system where that we determine product costs based on these standards. When you do standard costing, you're going to go through and basically record all the costs based on standards and also base it all on actuals. So you have something to compare with. So it's kind of like you're doing things twice. Primarily what we're going to be looking at is just figuring out the standards and comparing them to actuals rather than just going through recording all the standards and then doing the journal entries for variances. You can look through that in the book, but we're going to focus on calculating variances. Better understanding those right now. As far as the journal entries, you just debit or credit a variance account and that sort of thing. Where do standards come from? Well, they come from your past, what you've done. They come from engineering studies. They come from the accountants and all that sort of thing. So within the company is where you get the standards. There's no set means that you look in a book and that's going to tell you your standard. These are set within the company. Standards can change. When prices go up, you need to change your materials price standards. When you start paying your employees more, you need to change your labor rate standards. So standards can change. Variance analysis then is comparing with what should have happened with what did happen. So we can then see those. Did we pay too much? Did we use too much? That's the kind of things we're doing with the variance analysis. Any other background material? Yeah, that's good enough. And then, okay, one other thing. On variances, we also then determine if they're favorable or if they're unfavorable. Because we're primarily just going to be dealing with cost variances in here. The idea is if the cost actually came in higher than what you expected to, well, that's unfavorable. And you feel kind of bad about that. My costs were higher than I expected them to be. Now, when costs are lower than you expected them to be, you're kind of happy about that. So that's a favorable variance. But the thing is, we're going to find out that a favorable variance doesn't necessarily mean everything is all good. There are some favorable variances that can cause other unfavorable variances or cause problems in the long term. So we'll have to look at all variances that are outside some sort of acceptable range. Yes, things are going to vary. If you're dealing with price fluctuations, yeah, you probably have some sort of acceptable price fluctuation that you're fine with. Goes outside that acceptable range, be it favorable or unfavorable, you want to find out why. Why did we have this variance? So we'll investigate both favorable and unfavorable variances. All right. So we're going to be looking at Might Use Tasty Treats. I know I got this set for year ending 2007. Probably should have updated that, but you can add an 8 there if you want. It's no big deal. They make and sell gourmet chocolate chip cookies. So they wanted to evaluate the performance for this year. All right, so they have first page there. You got the standard information and you got the actual information. Overall, looking at total manufacturing costs. What did they expect to spend? I'm going to start with, they made 19,000 batches of cookies this year. $162,950 in actual manufacturing costs. So we can see right from the beginning that we have an unfavorable variance. Our actual cost came in higher than our expected cost. Now what we're going to be looking at here in variance analysis is we're basing all our costs on what actually we produced. Not some sort of budget number, not what we thought we should have produced, but what we actually produced. Because what would we get out of a budget number? Well, if we budgeted, let's say 18,000 cookies, or 18,000 batches, if we budgeted that much and we actually produced 19,000 batches of cookies, well, yeah, actual cost should be more. Because there's that variable component. That if I'm producing 1,000 more cookies, cost should go up. So that's not going to tell us anything if we use the budget number. So we got to figure out, based on what we actually produced, what our cost should have been versus what they actually came in. Because in that fact, then well, variable cost shouldn't change. It's the exact same base number, so we should have a variable cost per unit. It should stay constant. And fixed costs, well, they're fixed. They should have been the same. So there's some reason that has nothing to do with cost behavior as to why there's a variance here. Okay? That's the first thing to understand. We're always going to base it on actual production. So we got these costs. Variable manufacturing costs, the materials cost for a batch of cookies. So, came in at $4 is what we expected. It actually came in at $4.75. Labor costs, we expected $2 per batch of cookie. Actually came in at $2.55. Focus on those two first, materials and labor. Well, so materials, variable materials. Standard expected $4 per cookie. It actually $4.75. Well, even here, we still don't know why we have a 75-cent per batch variance. Total variance would be the 0.75 times 15,000. We still don't know why. Was it because the materials were higher priced? Or was it because we just used more? Okay, so just even looking at that, we don't have enough information. And the same with direct labor. So that's supposed to be 2. But it came in at $2.55. Did our direct labor workers work more hours? That would cause us to pay them more. That would average out more per batch. Or did we just give them a raise that we didn't record? Well, we can't tell that by just looking at the cost per batch of cookie. So we got to break our variances down into, what do I call them here? Down into price and usage. Sometimes usage would be called volume. That's the trade-off there. Price is typically what we call price. So that we could figure out if the price was higher for our direct materials, or did we just simply use more direct materials? Or was it some sort of combination of both? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at the direct materials and the direct labor and calculate price and usage variances. So, materials variances. What would happen? Well, we would have had our standard, and standard information. And what does our standard say? It says that the price, and we're just going to use one direct material ingredient, just a bag of chocolate chips, keep this simple. Price per bag. Well, based on past trends, based on past expectations, we would pay $4 per bag of chocolate chips. So it became our standard. We expect to spend $4 on a bag of chocolate chips. Our recipe says that we will need to add 1 bag of chocolate chips for each batch of cookies we make. So these are our standards. At least just for direct materials for now. That's what we expected. That would be like our recipe card. Spend $4 on a bag of chocolate chips, and we should use 1 bag of chocolate chips. What actually happened? Our actual quantity that we use becomes our actual price. Our actual cost for our direct materials, our chocolate chips, came into $90,250. Now we can quickly get that. If we go back to that first page where it was $475, comes to 19,000 batches of cookies. Means that our actual cost is $90,250. And so that's what we actually spent on these batches of cookies. Well, what should we have spent? Our standard cost. Well, we should have spent, if we go back to that first page, the $4 times the 19,000 cookies, $76,000. We actually spent $90,250. We should have spent $76,000. Okay, so we have an overall variance here. Total variance, unfavorable, $14,250. But what we don't know then, was it because we spent more, or is it because we used more? So we go and find out. We go and find out from the purchasing agent. Well, how much did we spend on these bags of chocolate chips cookies? And we find out that actually came in, on average, $3.80 per bag. We count up how many bags we used during this period. We made 19,000 batches of cookies, and find out that that came to 1.25 bags per batch. What does that mean? Well, that means that if we made 19,000 batches, 1.25 bags per batch, our actual quantity was 23,750 bags. So when we say actual, is actual quantity times actual price? Well, the actual quantity of bags used. $23,750. Actual price of bags. 1.25. 23,750 times 1.25. Comes to the 90,250. Actual quantity of bags we use. We use 1.25 bags per batch 19,000 batches means we use 23,750 bags. How you probably would get the number in real life is someone would say, we use 23,750 bags. So we use that many bags of chocolate chip cookies. But what do we pay for these chocolate chips? Or bags of chocolate chips. We pay $3.80 per bag. So our actual cost, $90,250.
That's 22,750 times 1.25.
I guess it shouldn't be that way.
Should be the
380. Dang it, why is it no matter? That's 380. That's the price per bag. So actual quantity that we use of bags times the actual price per bag. That's our actuals. That corresponds back to what we had with the $4.75 cost per batch of chocolate chips times the 19,000. That's basically where that $4.75 came. This is going through this route. Well, we want to know, did we spend more than we should have? So, we look at actuals, we look at standard, we can't completely see that information. So we have what's called, we'll call it a variance column. What this column is going to do, what is standard cost? It's the standard quantity times the standard price. So if we're going to want to compare to see, did we spend more per bag or did we use more bags than we should have, we're going to need something here that's going to be the middle ground between the two endpoints. We take this side is the actual quantity times that side is the standard price. Then we have a column available to us to do such comparisons. The actual quantity of bags used, 23,750. So we used 23,750 bags. Okay. What should we have spent on those? $4 per bag. If we were going to go out and buy 23,750 bags, we should have spent $4 per bag, or a total of $95,000. Based on our standards, if we were just to go out and buy 23,750 bags, then we should have spent $95,000. But what actually happened? We went out and bought 23,750 bags and only spent $90,250. Should have spent that. We actually spent that. So we have a variance of 4,750. Actuals came in less than what we expected to have spent on that many bags. That's favorable. And now, intuitively, you could look at that and tell me that, yeah, we spent less per bag. We spent $3.80, where we said $4. And you could tell me right off, well, that's a favorable variance. But here you can show me how much. And if you didn't have, completely broken down, you just had the total cost here of $90,250 without having the $3.80 actual price, you just would come up with this. So we know we bought the materials for a less cost. Favorable. Well, we're happy for that. What's that deal? But we start to think, well, why did we get them for a less cost? Because our overall variance, we can still see 76,000 and 90,250. Our total variance, well, that's off by 14,250. And we spent a whole lot more than we would have expected for 19,000 batches of cookies. Our overall variance is unfavorable, but we spent less per batch. Okay, well, that means we have a problem here. Standard, first I did 76,000. What's meant by standard quantity? Standard quantity is how many bags should have been used for actual production. So how many bags should we have used on 19,000 batches of cookies? Well, we expect to use one bag per batch, and we made 19,000 batches. Hence 19,000 bags we expected to use. Okay. When we get to direct labor and it's not one, you'll see that a little bit clearer. But that's standard quantity. Standard quantity isn't just one. We have to up it for how many bags we should have used. Just like a recipe card. When it tells you, you want to make a serving for 8, but it tells you that what to do for a serving for 4, what do? You double it. Well, essentially, we're 19,000th thing it, our recipe here. Times our standard price of $4 of the 19,000 times the 4. Okay? So 95,000 versus 76,000 is a 19,000 unfavorable variance. We used a lot more bags of chocolate chips than we expected to. So what do we do? Yeah, this is our variance. It's done with the fact we can't go back and change things now. We're analyzing what actually happened. For price variances, we typically go and talk to the person that's in charge of buying the chocolate chips. Big companies, typically that's the purchasing agent. It's some sort of form of whoever purchasing manager, purchasing agent, whoever's in charge of the purchasing responsibility. Hey, why spend less? What's going on? Tell you their story. Using the chocolate chips is a production thing. So we go to the production manager, whoever's in charge of the production function of the company. Why do you use more chocolate chips? And this is how a favorable variance possibly cause an unfavorable variance. Well, our chocolate chips are less quality than we usually have, so we're having to use more. Or, well, normally we get an 8-ounce bag. Suddenly these were only 6 ounces. We had to use more bags. That's why we still have to go and investigate favorable variance. Well, maybe we got a cheaper price because it's not the same chocolate chips we've been using. Because they're not the same, we have to use more of them. Overall, that's causing us to actually have higher costs. Yes, we're getting a break here, but we got to make sure that that break isn't causing undue harm further down in production. Now, it could also be the price of chocolate just went down, so we did get a deal. And we have Bob over here, our cookie maker, that's stealing chocolate chips from us. That can also be signaled in a variance analysis. You go and you find out that there's no other reason that we should be using 1.25 bags. You start watching Bob and see that he's grabbing a handful every now and then. So variance analysis will also start leading you in directions where you might want to investigate, take the fraud class, certain types of frauds that are going on, simpler things like stealing, or if you have an unfavorable variance here, you might want to check with your purchasing agent and the relationship with the vendor. If it's a relative, all of a sudden they're cutting a bigger deal with, or someone maybe they're getting a kickback on, variance analysis can start showing up those kinds of things. That's the benefit of variance analysis. You can see where the problem is. We know overall we spent more on the direct materials. We find out that because we used more, then it's the job of somebody to go and find out why. And the accountant, your idea is yes. The basic accounting function would be to come up with the variances. The good accountant will also come up with suggestions as to why those variances might exist or what we should do next. And start helping management make decisions. If you want that edge, you don't just calculate variances. You start thinking about why we have these variances and what we can do to figure out why. Okay? Questions? All right. So the direct labor variance? The direct labor variance tells more of the story. Direct labor. Our standard is $8 per hour that we pay, $8 per hour, and it typically takes 0.25 hours per batch of cookies. So, what were our actuals? Well, we actually spent $8.50 per hour and used 0.3 hours per batch. So, actual quantity. We made 19,000 batches of cookies, 0.3 hours. So we actually used 5,700 hours. Typically, what's going to be given to you is not in terms of how many hours per batch. It's going to be given to you in terms of actual hours used this period for 5,700 hours. It's typically the information you have. You go and you. That's what HR would give you. Here's how many hours. That's most of the policy gives you that. So, actual quantity of direct labor, 5,700 hours at a rate of $8.50 per hour. That means we actually spent on direct labor $48,450. Well, what did we expect to spend on direct labor? Standard quantity. It's number of batches, 19,000. How many hours of direct labor should we have used to make 19,000 batches? So it's hours per batch. Expect 0.25 hours per batch. It's supposed to take us a quarter of an hour to make a batch of cookies. So our standard hours is how many batches of cookies we did make times how long that should have taken us to make that many cookies. 4,750. We made 19,000 batches of cookies. Should have took us a quarter of an hour to make a batch. So 0.25 times the number of batches we actually made We should have used 4,750 hours this period. This year. I think I got that. And we expected to spend $8 per hour. So to make 19,000 batches of cookies, we expected that direct labor cost to come in at $38,000. So everything's based on what we actually produced. How much should that have cost us to make the actual production? How many hours it should have took us? Our standard cost for a quarter hour per batch of cookies, and $8 per hour. That's our standard. That's what we expected. So our total variance is 10,450 unfavorable. Our direct labor cost came in at 48,450. Our direct labor cost should have came in at 38,000. So why did we have these problems? Well, we got to figure out, did we use too many hours or did we pay too much per hour? So actual quantity of hours, we actually used 5,700 hours. Our standard price per hour is $8. Step 1, price variance. If we were going to get 5,700 hours of labor, what should that have cost us? It should have cost us $8 per hour. Should have cost us $45,600. 5,700 hours actually cost us $48,450. That means we have a variance of $28,50. 5,700 hours cost us more than we expected them to. So that's unfavorable. First thing to check. Well, did we give raises and not update our standards? You gave mid-year raises, and maybe you didn't have a chance to update your standards. You weren't expecting to give raises. Government stepped in, that's minimum wage on you, that sort of thing. Well, that would be the easy answer. That's what's causing it. All that means would be, okay, well, we're paying more per hour, now we need to change our standard. Or was it because we had to hire a higher skilled labor force? Suddenly our chocolate chip cookies have become very complex. We have to get the chocolate chip cookie experts in. Well, maybe that's why we had to spend more per hour. Or was there some sort of overtime factor coming in here that causes the average price per hour to go up, where we happen to, run overtime shifts because normal capacity is 18,000 batches of cookies. We had to add some extra hours in there, so we had to pay overtime. That could be an answer. Maybe we want to check into that. So those are reasons that the price variance may have be unfavorable. Usage of that direct labor. When we hold price constant, how would we use that direct labor? Typically, most books will call this an efficiency variance because it seems a little rude to talk about using people, and that's what direct labor is people. So how efficiently works the workforce instead of how well we use them. But to keep things consistent, so you don't have to memorize a new word, we'll call it a usage variance. But just know when you get out there that it sounds a little bit better to call it efficiency. But we have a difference here. We should have used 4,750 hours. We used 5,700 hours. That comes to a labor variance of 7,600. 7,600 versus versus 38,000. Unfavorable. Since all our variances are in terms of dollar amounts, not quantities. Using more hours resulted in a difference of $7,600. Well, if we match this up to our direct materials variances and say, hey, we bought with poor quality chocolate chips, that would cause a price variance. If we bought lower quality, hopefully we're spending less on them. Hopefully we wouldn't be spending more, but buy lower quality, spend less, have to use more. Well, if we're using more chocolate chips, or maybe even having to pick out those little ugly green pieces, because those don't make sense, well, our labor workers would have to be working more hours. That could result in an unfavorable variance here. So that's one story. Buying cheaper material, if it's poorer quality, could result in having to use more, because it's breaking on you, and more hours having to be worked. So that's how a favorable price variance could result in two unfavorable usage variances. Could also be the relationship if Bob is eating the chocolate chips, it's taking him more time because he's spending the time eating the chocolate chips and it's taking longer stirring the pot. That could also be a relationship between those two and have nothing to do with the price variance. See something else, if you find out that it's the exact same chocolate chips as you've been buying all along, another thing to investigate. But you guys are having that inquisitive mind. The numbers can only tell you so much. They just tell you the dollar amounts here. Then it has to come in your understanding of those dollar amounts to figure out what's going on. Yes, our first step is being able to calculate them. If we can't calculate them, then no, we can't go on and start figuring out why they are the way they are. Okay? Questions? All right, these are our two basic variances. You've seen these before in your principles class, even if it may have been a few years. We still have the overhead variances to go over next time. They're useful mentioning now. So any questions? All right, don't forget, work on your Excel project.